Hello there and welcome to the Drax Files Radio Hour. My name is Draxter, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming a wonderful author I recently became addicted to, and it's all due to a Twitter recommendation, which I find actually quite fascinating. Twitter recommended me recommended Anne Charnock to me, and turns out that Anne Charnock is writing fascinating speculative fiction. We'll ask her if it's actually sci-fi. I read one review where a reader was complaining like, this is not sci-fi. So we'll talk about what constitutes the genre. But anyways, welcome, Anne. Welcome to my little basement here.
Well, thank you. It's great. I love it in your basement. So thanks for the invitation. Great to be here.
It's very, very cozy. I have lots of your books around.
I know, I can see them.
You have a new book coming out as we go to air. It's already out. It's called Bridge 108, and we'll talk about it. But I would like to go a little chronologically first, because I actually read all your books in sequence, except for the Enclave, which the Enclave, I don't know if it's still in print, but it was like $60 on Amazon.
Yeah, well, The Enclave is a novella, so it would be very poor value for money at that price. But it's actually that novella forms the first, the first three chapters of the Bridge 108 builds on that.
Ah, because it's all, and we'll talk about that. You have a continuous universe. I mean, not all the books are set in the same universe, but there is continuity and recurring characters. I really love that. I say this all the time. I'm a big Frank Zappa fan, and Frank Zappa always talked about conceptual continuity. Of course, one could sort of cynically say, well, that just means you're just plagiarizing yourself and just repeating regurgitating your ideas. But so Calculated Life, let's start with that. Let me grab it. I have it right here and hold it into the camera. Calculated Life is a really, really interesting book. It's a very subtle world building, and it starts sort of with sort of an office worker, and it's all seems to be about sort of binary efficiency, and one wonders, where is this in the future? How far is this into the future? In the beginning, I thought the main character, maybe she has Asperger's.
Yes.
She is well integrated in her office work, but then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, it's a gradual, very subtle build where you become apparent that there is cognitive enhancement going on, and that determines what kind of job you have in this particular future.
With A Calculated Life, I started writing that novel not knowing if I could actually write a novel. So I just set off writing. And what kicked me off on that project was that I've been reading a number of texts about cognitive enhancement in the future. And I'd read Ray Kurzweil's book, The Age of Spiritual Machines. And in that, he envisaged a time in the future when we would have some people would have cognitive enhancements, presumably because they could afford them, and they would increasingly have difficulty communicating with people who didn't have cognitive enhancements. Now, that really freaked me out. I thought what he's predicting here is a kind of species schism, that humankind would follow different paths. I mean, already there's huge stratification in society.
It's that stratification, and now it gets even more codified. So the technology that is, always the promise that it's becoming very egalitarian and, and upward mobility and blah, blah, blah. But then in your book, it gets really codified. And it also seems on the surface in the beginning that is totally fine for everybody involved.
Well, I suppose I try to stick close to plausibility. And to my mind, if these enhancements came along, then it would be a question of who could afford them. The same it is with any technology. So it's a question of access as much as anything.
You were putting this into the context of affordability. Who can afford certain cognitive enhancements, and then how does that play out in their in their professional life, in their personal life, and so on.
Yes, I think the world I tried to build in A Calculated Life was such that, yes, society is more stratified than ever, but it's been organised in such a way by the state that everybody feels they're getting a reasonable deal. So even people at the bottom of the heap who can't have access to high quality jobs, they're living out in the enclaves, which is pretty basic accommodation. But they're getting subsidised housing, they're getting free electricity, free transport. So on the surface of things, people think, well, actually, it's not a bad deal.
That is so brilliant about your work. I mean, I'm really here the gushing fanboy, I gotta say, because the subtleness of your world building is you take a long time, you take your time in sort of exactly building that there are these different the people belonging to these different categories and classes, but they do seem, like you say, they seem to be fairly content with the deal that they're getting.
Yes.
And then in exposure with the other part, they realize, wait a minute, I've been really missing out on, not necessarily in this book about with material goods, but with really the wonderful complexity
Yes.
of life, right? I mean, that I find actually quite brilliant. It's not sort of jealousy about, well, this dude drives a better car than I do, whatever, or you know, this house is so much bigger. It's really about all these other much more important things like friendships and
Yes.
and depth of relationships.
Well, Jaina, who's at the top of the pile in terms of access to jobs, she's not only cognitively enhanced, she's been genetically engineered. So she's kind of this superhuman, but she's functioning within the work environment, either in the corporate world or her equivalents are also working in the state sector. So they're bringing enormous kind of profits to these organizations because they're so efficient. But Jaina, yes, she has a good deal in that she lives in a rest station where everything's provided for her. Meals are made, her laundry's done for her. She doesn't have to worry about money. She doesn't really have access to anything other than pocket money. And so she's got a pretty good deal, but then she starts to question things. And that's how I open the book, in that she keeps stick insects and she's suddenly surprised that the second smallest stick insect has died when it should have been the smallest one. And she begins to realize that she's making mistakes. And the fact she's making mistakes is making her wonder what's wrong with her life experience, that her intuition isn't quite well tuned.
Do you feel pressure as a sci-fi writer that in that genre to spice it up with sci-fi? I mean, I usually don't read reviews, but there is one or two reviews, I think, on Goodreads with your book where somebody says, well, you know, what's sci-fi about it? I mean, I'm totally paraphrasing, but I just want to throw this in there. Is that something where you, when you write, I mean, let's talk about process for a minute. Do you put yourself under pressure? Is there sort of a warning light that says, I gotta throw in some sci-fi tropes?
I don't feel pressured because I've always known from the outset of my writing that I don't want technology to be something that's talked about, in that, you know, we go about our daily lives and we don't talk about our tech unless it's going wrong. That's the only time we say, oh, my phone's not working. You know, oh, my laptop's failed. We don't talk about technology when everything's going smoothly. So because I've always seen myself as a kind of a realist, speculative fiction author, I don't want anything to feel contrived. So I kind of leave the tech in the background unless it really is intrinsic. You know, like one part of one of my novels was set in Renaissance Florence. And I did need to know, how do people get from A to B? Do they have a carriage? Do they have their own carriage? Do they go by horse? You know, it's the practicalities, you know, of sometimes you have to say how people get from A to B or how they communicate. But otherwise, you know, I shove it all in the background.
Sleeping Embers of the Ordinary Mind. That's your second book, the Smooth Transition, because I could talk and analyze the calculated life for several hours. The Sleeping Embers of an Ordinary Mind is magnificent. It's in three different time eras. It's in the 15th century, in present day, 2015, when you wrote it, I guess, and then in the future. And it's about women and the role of women in society. Talk to me about what sparked that, because I mean, you know, I don't want to mansplain your own book to you. What is it about? It's a wonderful book.
Well, thank you. I mean, I must admit, I loved writing it, and that was the book. As I was writing it, constantly, as I was writing it, I thought there's probably only me and 6 other people who will want to read this book, because on the one hand, it's speculative fiction, but on the other hand, we've got Renaissance Florence and nuns. You know, there's nuns in this story. So I thought, who wants to read this? But I loved writing it. So
there's also drawing and painting and well, I mean, I guess the pitch for people in visual entertainment or virtual worlds would be, it talks about Paolo Uccello, who was instrumental in bringing three-dimensionality into 2D painting. So you could pitch it to gamers that way a little bit.
Before I started writing, I'd gone back to my studies, whereas I'd been a scientist originally and gone into science journalism. I then, at a later date, went back to university and studied fine art up to master's level. And so I'd done a lot of research as part of that re-education. And in a way, the research I'd done, I kind of put on a shelf, and I thought it would be a shame not to kind of use it in my fiction. You know, I love art as much as I do science. And I really wanted to have an art historian as a main character. So I spent quite a lot of time just letting the ideas percolate. And in the end, I thought, right, I'm going to have an art historian in the future correcting the historical record, so that this Academy of Restitution is going to find the women who've been overlooked in the canon.
Right, and that's the future part of this sort of three-prong different eras. The future has a department of reassessment where, is it called reassessment or reconstitution?
It's the Academy of Restitution.
Right, and they research women through art history and bring them back to their proper, or bring them back. I mean, they elevate them to their proper status in history that was usually occupied by men who, well, I mean, spoiler alert, men do kind of control run the show here.
So what I did was I looked at the art historical periods that I was interested in, usually at a cusp. So I was interested in that transition from the Byzantine to early Renaissance painting. And then I was also interested in the emergence of modernism in France, you know, the era of Gauguin and Maurice Denis. Well, I'll not go into all the names. But so I was interested in those cusps. I thought, what actual artists could I focus on? And I was looking at a whole bunch of artists, and then I thought Paolo Uccello, because he's into perspective. There's a kind of almost scientific angle to his art. And then I started doing research, and lo and behold, his daughter in real life was a painter. And I did more and more research and found that there's very, very little known about her. But at one point I did find a footnote in an academic book that it was called Nuns and Nunneries in Renaissance Florence. It's one of the best books I've ever read. Fantastic research. And in a footnote,
we just lost three more viewers out of the 6, and I don't mind at all. Please continue. This is wonderful.
There was a footnote saying where she had lived and where she had painted. And so I went back to Florence to find out more about her. And that kind of fed directly violently into the novel. But essentially, I use this art historian in the future to look back at women and young girls' lives in the present day and in Renaissance Florence. So the future becomes a lens to see women's lives today and yesteryear.
Yeah, and for me, what was fascinating about this, I mean, you basically the way I read this in the 15th century, Antonia, the daughter of Paolo Uccello, she gets trained. He sees that potential in her. He wants her to become a painter, but of course, the times were such that you could either become a wife or you go into the convent, and the family chose the latter, where she then actually has the freedom to pursue. I mean, this is all what you sort of put in there. This is not factual as far as we know. But she went to this convent, and in your book, she then is confined in a prison, but she has access to her art, and she can pursue her art, which she would not have been able at all in so-called, real life or married life at the time. And then in the present day, we have a painter who makes copies for money, and his daughter is instrumental in sort of pushing him towards fulfilling his true calling. And then in the future, have this art historian.
In the future, the main character there, she is brought up in an all-female household where they've all been born via parthenogenesis, so there's no male being involved in their creation. So that just gives the kind of futuristic twist to the novel.
And I'm throwing in again a process and the marketing aspect of it. Just a note: how did you pitch this book? I mean, you have a relationship with 47 North, which is, I was not aware, this is an Amazon subsidiary. Amazon is doing a lot also for translation. I read The Grey House, which they translated. So they're really doing a lot here, publishing, and it's fantastic. But how do you go there, hey, I got a great idea. There's 3 stories that are not necessarily connected, and it's all about women and parthogenesis, which we'll talk about in a sec. How was that received when you first sort of pitched that?
I have to admit, I made the worst pitch ever for this novel, in that I met up with, in fact, I had a new editor at the time. My editor for A Calculated Life had moved on to Harper Voyager. So I met with my new editor first over in Seattle and then again in London about a year later. And so I did a verbal pitch for this novel face to face when I only had I think I only had 3 chapters written, and it was completely garbled. I did not impress myself. I thought, I'm sure American writers make a better pitch than this.
Oh, yeah, they have elevator pitches in Silicon Valley. They cannot be longer than 12 seconds.
Well, I was terrible. But he said, oh, well, keep going with it. And then when I'd reached about 2/3 of the way through the book, I asked if he'd like to see how it was going and if he'd like to have some input before I tried to tie it all up. So I showed it to him and he really liked it, gave me a little bit of advice, and then I continued with it, finished it. And I'm very fortunate that my editor there, Jason Kirk, he was really interested in work that was a bit more experimental, that took a few risks. In fact, if anything, he's always pushed me to kind of take more risks. So that's been brilliant.
I mean, that is really wonderful, because also one aspect of this book is that it does not, neatly tie it together or wrap up, which I personally love. I mean, I don't want to get off a tangent here, but I have some people perceive me as having a disdain for popular culture, especially Hollywood films. I don't, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but the reason why I just don't enjoy it is because the formulaic nature of most of the bigger things they leave me very empty. So when I read something like this, where the end is very open and very open to interpretation, I see this as a total plus. But I can see in society where we're so conditioned to,
Yes.
oh, these questions have been, I mean, this is also part of fan culture, I guess, in popular culture, where writers in Hollywood, I don't know how they, I mean, they must take a lot of anti-anxiety medication, because they can be bombarded by fans like, wait a minute, in season 3, episode 5, you didn't wrap this up, you didn't do this, and blah, blah, blah. So obviously you have a support system
Yes.
that kind of supports you in that sense, and you don't seem to be overly concerned about meeting those types of expectations either.
Well, it's true what you say. I do have an excellent support system, as you say, and that's the key thing. It's only when the book goes out in the world, that's when I have to brace myself, because I know I'm going to get pushback because the endings are open. And I don't know if that's partly because of the way literature is taught in schools, that people are taught that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, that's just complete nonsense. I mean, I didn't study English, but from my reading, and I've always felt if you're following a path of realism, then, life's not like that. If someone was to make a novel of my life, heaven forbid, where would they begin it and where would they end? And would that really be the end? It's just not, I just find it contrived. And what I don't want to do is spoon feed. I don't want to spoon feed the reader. I like to assume that they're more intelligent than me, that I don't need to spell things out. In the way, it's not like watching a TV series where there's a recap at the beginning of every episode for people who may have forgotten what had come previously. I just feel spoon feeding is like insulting. And I'd rather have it open-ended, and people can assume what they want. People can read the endings as they like. I mean, for example, with Sleeping Embers of an Ordinary Mind, in my mind, the ending, I don't know if I should talk about this really, but put it this way, in my mind, Antonio Uccello was doing things or seeing things that or almost seeing into the future, that she was taking a step further than her father away from realistic painting. But he couldn't recognize that. He couldn't recognize the genius of his daughter in my make-believe story. So she was capable of making advances away from realistic painting that he couldn't make. But, that was my take. But other people are free to think what they like.
I don't want to mention the name of the artist that comes to mind. There's actually a great biopic made with a great American actor in it.
Even earlier, when she's choosing her color palettes and she's trying to lose the subject, again, that's calling up a whole raft of early 20th century work. So
now we lost the last 3 listeners because we're so in the geekiness of this wonderful universe. Let's bring them back by going to the next book and then to the current book. So the next book then in the sequence is Dreams Before the Start of Time, and this introduces us. It is in the similar universe, or partially, that you had explored before. And it introduces us to parthenogenesis. Please enlighten me what it is. This is what some insects can do. This is what plants do. But this is not what humans can do. I mean, it's using an unfertilized egg to create to procreate within with yourself.
Well, I think there'll be different options in the future. It isn't cloning. It's similar, very similar. But in fact, there are 2 routes that I'm imagining for the future: to take 2 eggs, one slightly immature compared to the other, and by putting them in a soup, you can create an embryo. Or you can, in the future, have synthetic Y combined with an egg to create a child. But the theory is that with parthenogenesis, using two eggs to create a child, you can only create a girl, you can't create a boy. And that this girl would be more like, rather than a clone, it would be more like a sibling, a brother or a sister, that you would create. So this book is really looking at different ways in the future that will make families, partly because we'll be able to use stem cells to create an egg or semen, but also we'll have new biomechanics, we'll have artificial wombs. So this combination of different routes to creating an embryo plus artificial wombs means that, in theory, anybody will be able to create a child. So I'm looking.
Anybody, given the again, you create a scenario where there is a class difference, and if when you say everybody, of course you have to have a certain amount of cash lying around if you want to go that route, and that creates then different spheres of class again. People who can afford and people who still sort of get pregnant the old-fashioned way and carry to term. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think. What would happen is that these technologies will be developed for people who have total reproductive failure, either through having suffered cancer, but they're physically no longer able to have children. And this technology will be developed for them. But it will eventually roll out and be available more widely. Now, yes, it will be people who can afford it, and it will be in countries that allow this to happen. So it could be that you would have to travel to a different country that had less tight guidelines for particular procedures or for particular bits of housekeeping on the genome. So it's a question, one, of who has access, who has the money, what's available on a national health service, what has to be paid for. And of course, this is another possibility for having some kind of schism where people will be fast tracking towards theoretically towards success because they've got this ideal start in life. Although of course life doesn't always pan out like that. Just because you've got every advantage doesn't necessarily mean you take those advantages. So really the book's looking at possible fallout in relationships among people who have this access, and I wanted to position this story time-wise at a time when this technology isn't available to everyone. It's just becoming mainstream, but there's still debate about it. It's still slightly controversial. So it has able to kind of show that these kind of fairly well-to-do middle-class families who are using this, what are the issues that are coming up for them? What are the unexpected consequences? And how does this compare to, say, the character of Freya, who's having a child in relative poverty? So in a way, Freya casts the previous story, the previous two sections of the novel, into a new light by looking at her particular route to parenthood.
And we also have to say it jumps forward in time, so there are leaps, and then characters recur, or the children and grandchildren of these characters reoccur. Freya is an amazing character, but also now I forgot her. Is it Millie? Wait a minute. Yeah, and her parents. I mean, I was laughing out loud when when her parents said when she's having a baby and having a heterosexual relationship. I think the parents said, well, the father said, well, at least you're not gay anymore. I guess trying to make a joke. So what I read into I have to say, I mean, I did. I'm just. I cry frequently with books. I did cry here because it's also about this incredibly life-changing choice of having children or not having children. This to me is at the basis of this book. Or, for some people it is not a choice, obviously. So we can't say, well, you made the wrong choice. Some people don't have the choice. So all these things are in this book, and that's what I found so profoundly moving. It really forces you to ask these questions. Is this selfish what I'm doing? Do I just want a little mini me running around? Then given the state of the world, and you do this without being heavy-handed, which is so rare. Even my big hero of British literature, David Mitchell, I know you enjoy him as well. Even I would say, David Mitchell is a master, but I would say even he gets a little bit heavy-handed sometimes, or and you kind of accomplish to evoke these questions that the reader asks. At least I did, but without hitting you over the head with it. It's yeah.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. I mean, for me, it's that as soon as I start writing something that seems a bit heavy-handed, I can feel myself blushing with embarrassment, like, oh, how inelegant is that?
I'm exactly the other way. I go like, let's double down on it. Maybe that's a male thing. I don't know.
Well, there's different ways, and we all have different ways of writing, and what feels not. I mean, I don't want to feel that I always have to write in this way, but it's just the way that I feel is the only way I can write speculative fiction at the moment.
What was interesting is Joe Haldeman was here last, and he said that he gets lauded for writing from a female point of view, and he said it was easy for him to imagine himself as a woman until the age of where the crucial decision comes about childbirth.
Well, that could be the reason why there hasn't been an awful lot of discussion about pregnancy and childbirth in science fiction over the decades.
Oh, I think it's totally taboo, right? I mean, or are you saying it's male dominant? Well, it's so male dominated.
Well, certainly, you go back to the age of 50s and 60s science fiction. It was male dominated. I mean, obviously, some writers were attempting to cover pregnancy and childbirth, and women were writing about the subject, like Joanna Ross. But I think also the issue is that back in those days, I don't think men went into the labour ward. So, the women were having the babies and the men just weren't present. So they didn't have the experience of childbirth.
They were at a bar.
They were at the bar. They didn't see it. So maybe they weren't aware that it was an issue, it wasn't a problem that needed solving. Whereas for me, I mean, I've had 2 children, and for me, it was a problem that needed solving. And it is something I wanted to address in fiction, but not with a tub thumping, this has to change. It's like I spoke with geneticists. I spoke with Dr. Arati Prasad, who wrote the book Like a Virgin, how science is redesigning the rules of sex. And so I had a great discussion with her. I went to one of her talks, and I could see from there what the possibilities were 40 or 50 years down the line, maybe sooner, who knows. But I was thinking, well, 40, 50 years down the line, this could be happening. And how will it feel? And what will be the unintended consequences? Will women in the corporate sector be pressured to use an artificial womb so that the workflow is less disrupted, that they're not constantly going for doctor's appointments?
Yeah, that's one of those, again, the universe that you already created with remote gestation, and you have artificial wombs, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So that started in the previous book, and then continued into Dreams Before the Start of Time. And funny, it's one of the earlier points you were making about, is it science fiction? I did have male readers, personal friends, who said, yeah, it's a nice book, It's like it. I'm someone who really likes science fiction, but it's like the tech isn't really there. And I said, well, yeah. I said, there's childbirth. Like you've had children. You were in the delivery room, and they were saying, yeah, but it doesn't really affect me, does it?
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't their kind of technology, It was kind of.
Well, yeah, you didn't describe the gestation machine in detail like a manual for an engine, for a jet engine or something.
Yeah.
If you throw that in next time, I'll guarantee you'll get more male readers. But no, I mean, this goes to show you again I don't want to judge people, but it's a lack of the ability to have empathy for people from other people, other genders, other people from other walks of life. Do you feel that literature, in particular, can change people's convictions about a subject matter, or get them to contemplate at least changing their position on it?
People who read novels probably do have the mindset that they're willing to be persuaded to a different point of view.
You won't even reach people who don't want to or don't want to change, I guess.
Yes.
So you're saying like the reader is someone, or maybe your reader is someone who wants to be exposed to a different point of view.
I think so. The question is if a piece of literature is taken into, say, film or TV, is that medium or into a game, is that medium equally capable of shifting points of view, equally capable of getting the user or the viewer to empathize? I think that's an interesting question for me to ask other people. It's like, does it have the same impact?
It could mean that these are, again, a group of people who are preconditioned to wanting to be exposed, and it just gets that division between, we have the have-nots division. We may have the, want to be exposed to other thought versus the want to just be completely confirmed.
Hopefully people will be more empathetic and will consider different points of view, or at least more, even if for a few pages, to understand somebody's motivation, that people aren't just what you see, that people are never nobody conforms to any stereotype. And so it's a question of breaking down those stereotypes to show people's motivations, where they're coming from, and what their individual journey is in life, as opposed to just a snapshot. So hopefully that comes across.
We have managed to almost spend the entire hour not even talking about your new book, but that's good, because then people get the appetite is growing, so that the new book is going to fly off the shelves. Let me say one thing about the the commercial aspect. I would say that visual media, and this does not exclude books, because once you talk about it, a book is also a commercial medium, and books need to be sold in order to print new books and all that kind of thing. But because of the cost of making visual entertainment, the conservatism built into the medium is, I would argue, a lot higher. And by conservative, I mean sort of fiscally conservative, meaning let's not take a lot of risk and let's try to milk this as much as we can. One really bad example is the wonderful young adult novel 13 Reasons Why, about teenage suicide, and that was made into a Netflix series. So they expanded that into a freaking series. I get mad just thinking about it. It makes absolutely no sense. So they took a subject matter which in the book was dealt with in an enormously sensitive way, an impactful way, and transported that into a visual medium that looks so glossy. There is no way you can do this topic justice, in my mind, with the glossiness with the sheen of the medium. You know what I'm saying?
I don't think I could ever write a series. I don't think I can think in that kind of way, breaking up arcs. And the only thing I have done is to write Bridge 108, my fourth novel, in the same world as my first novel. Sorry, just clear my throat. So, so that I kind of see these books as companion novels, and as you've read them, you'll see that the storylines don't cross as such, and it's a different set of characters. But for me, I just wanted to explore a different. Whereas A Calculated Life, as we were saying earlier, is largely about the people who are at the top of the pile. With all the cognitive enhancements, Bridge 108 is really looking at the people at the bottom of the pile, who are living out in the enclaves, scratching a living. Very much, there's a kind of semi-illegal economy, and a lot of the economy of the enclaves is based on free power and cheap food, which is only possible because they're using migrant labour working on in indentures, working to earn the right to stay in the country. So that book turns around and turns the whole world of a Calculated Life around, to look at what a future England might look like in terms of how will people react to climate migrants arriving in the UK, not from a faraway place, but from within Europe.
Right. And what's fascinating is, I mean, you know, I titled the show that you're tackling climate fiction. I do think that this is climate fiction, but you never really explicitly, I mean, you mentioned it in passing once, but I think it's really, I mean, you need to look at it in this context. If you read Bridge 108 today with the migrants coming in, it's really brilliant that, again, you're not hitting people over the head with the setup of the world. The world sort of unfolds. It's marvelous, and it's told through these different, the shadow economy. I don't know what the right term would be.
Yeah, I think that would be a good one.
Or and people have every one of these people is I guess flawed, but they have to work within their, and they're cruel too, but they have to work within their environment. So the cruelty is imposed on them through this. I mean, that's how I read it. I mean, I read everything in the neoliberal context these days. I'm apologizing, but the cruelty of these people is the system brings it out in them, and so they lash out while they could be in solidarity.
Yeah, I think they're all working the system. I think what I was trying to put across was that, again, that, you know, nobody fits the stereotype, that they've all got interesting backgrounds, that nobody's completely a villain. They all have redeeming qualities. And yes, they're all doing the best they can to scrape by, but no, they're not coming together. They're all squeezing what they can out of the situation that they're in. And yes, it does mean that they're exploiting other people.
See, that this is a book for the 1%. They're intensely worried that workers realize, hey, wait a minute, if we get it together in solidarity, then, you know, we can actually upend the power structure. I can see somebody at Davos reading, you'll get invited to Davos next year, like, Bridge 108 is the template that we need to follow in order to keep these little, you know, the plebs fighting amongst each other while we are reaping in the profits. And Charnock, you are a new hero. Would you like to take the limo to the reception?
Oh my God, I'm giving people bad ideas.
You know, I mean, again, it goes to how do you read stories and how do you then fit them into your ideology, I guess. Well, I just admitted, I read everything from a Marxist point of view, but sorry, go ahead.
So you can't, obviously, you can't dictate how people are going to read your book and what their takeaway is going to be. You know, you come from it one angle, someone else will come from another and think, oh yeah, that sounds a real great idea, let's do that.
So Bridge 108 is coming out, or actually it is out when we're going to air, and I wish you much success with it. It's wonderful, and I thank you so much for writing and sort of filling my head with ideas. And what is next? So what I actually usually ask at the end is, are you pursuing? How important is actually, speaking about film or television? I know it's a huge financial thing, which is good, and it keeps you going if you sell movie rights. But is that something that you pursue? Would it be important to you? Would you be terrified if to see something that is completely mutilated, or could you let your baby, your grown-up child, go onto a different medium and say, you know what, I gave birth to this child, but she became her own?
Yeah, I think more than anything, I'd be fascinated to see how it translated to a different medium. And I wouldn't feel controlling. I mean, if a film was made, I would imagine it would start from a completely different premise. I would just be intrigued to see. In fact, occasionally I think, oh yeah, if this was to be a film, I would start with that scene. That would be the scene. It wouldn't be the first scene in the book. It would be a completely different way of starting it. So no, I'd just be fascinated. And if the film was rubbish, they wouldn't blame me, would they?
That's a really good point. You have plausible deniability right there. What's next? Are you working on something new? Are you always working? Is there several different things in the pipeline that then kind of get thrown away and then one takes precedence? Or
I think, the way in which the books have been published isn't always the order in which they're written. So, for example, I started Dreams Before the Start of Time before Sleeping Embers of an Ordinary Mind, but I put it to one side for a year to write my second novel. So at the moment, I'm working on an idea that I've had for several years, and I've only just now kind of finished the other writing projects that are allowing me to start on that. So I'm about halfway through another novel. There's science in it, but I can't really say much more than that, because who knows what's going to happen as the book progresses, and whether it'll go off in one speculative direction or go off in another. So yeah, just still writing, and there's still science, and there's still climate issues there.
I'm not excited about the impending doom of the planet, but I'm excited about your new novel. And again, take my advice, Anne, throw in a 50-page description of whatever gizmo you come up with. Thank you, Anne, and thank you guys for watching and listening to this. Then please pick up Anne's new book, Bridge 108. We have it right here. Let's hold it up. And next up is I forgot, you guys got to look at the events.sansa.com calendar. Matt Ruff is coming with a VR-themed novel. And then in quick succession, Ken Liu, Simon Sellers, and then I'll be on the road for a couple of weeks. But so you have time to read all of Anne's body of work before Matt comes in. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.